It is interesting to contemplate a tangled bank. Hello everyone, my name is Aaron. I am a birding naturalist. Welcome to my channel. That line is from On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection by Charles Darwin. And that's actually what I want to talk to you about today. What did Darwin actually propose? What is evolution by means of natural selection? There's a lot of talk about evolution, about natural selection, about what it is, what it isn't, if it's true, if it's not. I studied evolution as a graduate student. My research was on how behaviors can contribute to one population breaking into two or more and causing speciation to occur, causing the creation, the formation of new species. One thing that I find kind of frustrating is with all of that talk about evolution, it seems like a lot of it comes from people who are not evolutionary biologists. So, to throw in an opinion into the rink, to give some perspective from someone who is an evolutionary biologist, I wanted to kind of talk about what Darwin actually proposed. Because in a lot of ways, it's really much simpler than is often advertised. There are a lot of complicated implications from it, but what the actual principle is pretty cut and dry. And it rests on four major components, major facets, major ideas. And those are variability, heritability, superfecundity, and non-random mortality. Well, what does all that mean? That's what we're going to talk about. So, variation. Variation just means that individuals in a population are not identically the same, right? And I mean, it's difficult to argue with that. You look at humans and yep, you can tell one human from another. You look at dogs and yep, you can tell one dog from another. You look at whales and humpback whales, say, and you can say, yep, I can tell one humpback whale from another. It may take a sort of trained professional eye from a human perspective to tell maybe one zebra from another, but it's pretty clear those zebras can tell each other apart. And this is across the board. There was research that came out not that long ago, maybe a year ago or so, that indicated that some wasps could recognize individual facial patterns of their fellow wasps. So individuals absolutely vary. So that's the first one, variation. The second one, heritability. That's the idea that this variation, or at least some components of this variation, are passed down from parent to offspring. And again, it's kind of hard to argue that that's wrong. I mean, again, with humans, we see family resemblances are absolutely passed down from one generation to the next. You have a grandfather who looks a lot like his grandson and his son in between. And the same is true with other animals as well. And plants and fungi. Like these are universally sort of true statements that the variations that are present in individuals often get passed down to those individuals' offspring. So that's the second one. The third one is superfecundity. Fun word. Basically what it means, though, is that more organisms are born or produced in some way each generation than really can possibly survive. And again, it's difficult to argue that that is wrong. Animals die. Plants die. When you're looking at acorns produced by an oak tree, many of those acorns get eaten by a squirrel or a deer or quail or turkeys. Those seeds were produced. They don't survive. They don't make it to adulthood. But enough are produced that we still have oak trees around. So some of them are surviving, just not all of them. More individuals are produced than can possibly survive. And that sets up, that's the third one, and it sets up the fourth one. The fourth one is non-random mortality. So if there are more individuals than can possibly survive, which ones die? Which ones don't make it to adulthood, don't make it to the stage where they can then produce their own offspring? While there is certainly some randomness to that, a lot of it is not random. Overall, on average, the slowest gazelles are the ones that get eaten by the cheetahs. It's not random. The fastest gazelles are, generally speaking, overall, the ones most likely to survive and reproduce because they didn't get eaten by the cheetahs. And the same is true of the cheetahs. Overall, on average, the cheetahs that die are going to be the slow ones because they weren't able to catch those gazelle. It's not random. And so, again, that's kind of hard to argue that it's false. It seems logical that the polar bear with the thinnest fur is not going to do very well. Polar bears need thick fur to survive in the Arctic. So which ones die and which ones don't, on average, is very often not at all random. And this use of the word random is an interesting one. It's an important one. It's worth touching on because oftentimes the case against evolution is made because of this term, of this word, randomness. Evolution can't possibly be true. Natural selection can't possibly be true. Because sheer randomness would not explain the natural world. Okay, well, that's true. Sheer randomness would not explain the natural world, but sheer randomness is not what Darwin proposed. There is some randomness at that first stage, that variability stage. Sometimes mutations occur that are at least somewhat random. Sometimes. There are also plenty of influences that cause mutations to not be random. There are parts of our DNA code that are much more likely to be mutated and sort of not really fixed than other parts. So even that, it's not completely random. But there is some degree of randomness in some components. And in the second part, heritability, there's a certain degree of randomness there. I mean, we, mammals, for example, have two chromosomes, two copies of each chromosome. So you get one copy from your mom and one copy from your dad. And which one gets passed on to your offspring, to each individual offspring, has a certain level of randomness to it. Is it version A or version B? But again, it's not totally random there either, because what is associated with what in terms of genes on a chromosome, those sort of get carried as a unit oftentimes. There are certainly things that make it less random. So there's a component of randomness in heritability, but also very much not. I mean, heritability does sort of work out, as I said, with humans. You can see parent to offspring to their offspring to their offspring. These family traits absolutely do occur. So heritability, while it has some component of randomness, has plenty that's not random. So there's a little bit of randomness in variability. There's a little bit of randomness in which one is our heritability. There's not really much randomness in superfecundity. Pretty much every organism is trying to support and produce as many organisms, as many versions of itself, as many offspring as they can. Kind of one of these biological imperatives that we have is to create relatively large numbers of offspring. And I say relatively because some organisms really double down on that and try to produce thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of organisms. Some organisms don't. Some organisms have a strategy to produce just like one or two offspring. But even that, if they really want, there's a drive in species to produce that one or two offspring, to not produce zero offspring, for example. Because, I mean, if you think about it, any organism that has sort of a biological imperative to not reproduce would go extinct. So, yeah, not really a lot of randomness involved in that third idea, that third concept of superfecundity. And non-random mortality, much though it says non-random mortality, I mean, we all have to acknowledge that to a certain extent, there is a bit of luck involved in who dies and who lives in a given generation. I mean, you could have, I mean, it's easy to sort of contemplate a population of organisms living in this beautiful river valley and very, very well evolved for their environment, and some of the individuals being particularly excellently well evolved. They are the fastest, they're the strongest, they're the thickest furred, they're the best camouflaged, whatever the case may be, whatever they need to do to survive. Their particular individuals are really good at it. And then the mountain next door explodes in a volcano and the entire population is wiped out. Being the thickest furred, being the best camouflaged individual in that population is not going to help them in that case, right? So there is some level of just luck involved in who lives and who dies. But on average, in a lot of ways, most of the time, you know, barring crazy stuff like that, barring wild weather patterns, when you're talking about sort of day-to-day life for most organisms, it is non-random. Most of the time, most of the organisms that die because of a more sort of everyday pressure. It's parasitism, it's predation. They starve because they can't find enough food. These are the much more common, like I said, everyday occurrences that kind of influence a population by killing off some of them and not killing off others. So while we've just talked about some randomness in these various features of natural selection that Darwin proposed, yeah, there is some randomness in these various stages, but most of them isn't. Most of the stuff that we're talking about, most of the stuff that explains the natural world is absolutely non-random. I also want to talk about one last component of this, and that is two terms: evolution and natural selection. Darwin did not discover evolution. The idea that species change, that some species go extinct, was in existence and was being wrestled with for well before Darwin was born. He didn't discover this. What he proposed was the subtitle of his book, On the Origin of Species, by means of natural selection. He proposed a mechanism to explain why some organisms go extinct, why you see organisms that are so well adapted to their environments. Natural selection is what Darwin came up with. Natural selection is also what this guy Alfred Russel Wallace also came up with, a little bit after Darwin, but they collaborated at about the same time as Darwin was finishing up his work. And natural selection is what you get if those four tenets that we talked about are all true. Do individuals in a population vary from one another? Yes. Is some of that variation passed on from parent to offspring? Is it heritable? Yes. Are more organisms born or produced each generation than can possibly survive? I mean, yes. Is who lives and who dies not random? Yes. If those four things are true, then one of the implications of that is that generation after generation, there's this sorting process that causes the most fit organisms to generally survive and reproduce. It will cause, almost inevitably, the formation of species that are more and more adapted to their environment. And this is all species in all environments, taking into account all aspects of the environment, including other species. Predators influence prey, prey influence predators. Parasites influence hosts, hosts influence parasites. All these things, all organisms sort of put pressures on each other through this complicated network that results in a niche that is filled by an organism, and that organism does a better and better job of filling, or generation after generation after generation. Through this process, through the operation of these four tenets that we call natural selection. So I hope that gives you some thoughts. I hope that explains the basics of natural selection. Darwin didn't know everything. Darwin, for example, wasn't sure how heritability worked. He was pretty sure it had to work, somehow. But he didn't know about genes. He didn't know about DNA. He didn't know about genetics at all. That came later, and that reinforced his ideas. That sort of provided explanations for how his concept of heritability works. He didn't have all the pieces, but he did have the major pieces. The major pieces that have since been explained and reinforced by thousands of scientists working for nearly 200 years, reinforcing these four basic tenets and the outcomes of those tenets. The tangled bank with endless forms most beautiful. Thank you very much for the view. And until next time, enjoy the natural world.